Project 2025, it's a think tank's 900-page policy roadmap at the center of debate in the presidential election. A plan for executing a sweeping conservative agenda, a complete overhaul of the federal government as we know it. But is it the agenda for a new Republican-led nation? Or is it an overhyped, unrealistic conservative wish list with little chance of becoming law?
Now, this is Talking Points on CBS News Minnesota.
Good evening and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Esme Murphy. Tonight we look at Project 25, the document created by the conservative think tank, the Heritage Foundation. It outlines an agenda for a conservative president taking office in 2025. It proposes eliminating the Departments of Homeland Security, Education, as well as Head Start and the Affordable Care Act. It calls for gutting 50,000 civil service jobs for political appointments. And it calls for registering teachers and librarians who distribute certain materials as sex offenders who could get jail time. As Democratic criticism of Project 25 has ramped up, former President Trump has tried to distance himself. But that's been difficult because so many former Trump staffers are contributors to the project. Reportedly under pressure from Trump, the director of Project 25 and a former Trump aide, Paul Dans, resigned. But the Democratic attacks have only escalated. Let's start our analysis with Professor Larry Jacobs. Joining us right now is a longtime political scientist, Professor Larry Jacobs of the Humphrey School at the University of Minnesota. Thank you so much for coming on.
Good to be with you.
Okay, Project 2025, a lot of people are talking about it. A lot of Democrats actually seem to be genuinely concerned about it. What do you think? Is this having any kind of impact on this election?
It may have an impact on the election, particularly in terms of motivating Democrats and liberals about the different agenda of the Trump administration. I'm not sure that the voters who are really up for grabs are going to get into the weeds of what's in Project 2025.
In terms of the people that seem to be talking about it the most, just in what I've seen, certainly people in the LGBTQ plus community seem most concerned and really concerned. I mean, it seems to be high up on what they are talking about and thinking about going into this election.
Yes, so the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative organization, has put forward this smorgasbord of conservative ideas for the next Republican administration. They think of it as the second revolution. And among the number of proposals is to direct the Department of Health and Human Services to pursue a biblically based definition of family and marriage. We usually don't see that kind of language in political documents, and it's obviously caused real concern among LGBTQ folks in America.
Right, and it's also created concerns amongst people who are not Christian, of which there are a whole lot in this country.
Right, and the document is actually quite sweeping. It makes a number of proposals to expand executive power, the power of the president, weaken the power of the Department of Justice, create ways to replace nonpartisan civil servants with loyalists. It talks about sending the military to the border, eliminating the Department of Education, and a host of other things. So this is really chock full. It's a very meaty proposal. I've read through parts of it, and there's a lot here.
At its essence, as you mentioned, it talks about expanding the executive power. Aren't we already in the middle of an expansion of the executive power with this Supreme Court, which obviously, if Donald Trump wins, the likelihood of him appointing a new Supreme Court justice is pretty high?
Yeah, I mean, the Supreme Court has been giving the thumbs up to a number of actions and new precedents for presidents to push their powers to act unilaterally. That's the issue here, that presidents are not acting within the scope of existing law or with authorization from Congress. It's taking actions on its own, and the Supreme Court has been approving some of that, including the recent decision expanding immunity for presidents for actions taken while in office. all of this is seen as really a new chapter in American politics, perhaps breaking from the idea from checks and balances that the framers of the Constitution had established.
Donald Trump is saying, hey, this is not our blueprint. It's the Heritage Foundation's blueprint. Democrats are linking the two. Is it fair? Is it right to put the two together in any way?
Well, there are a number of Trump allies. There are several dozen former Trump administration officials who participated. There's some overlap between Project 2025 and the Trump administration agenda. So there's reason to be concerned. On the other hand, Donald Trump's position on abortion is quite different from what we have in Project 2025, and you can find other areas of difference. And it needs to be said that at this moment, there are all sorts of conservative and liberal groups who are putting together proposals, hoping that their allied administration would pick up their agenda. So what's different about 2025 is it's getting a lot of attention, and it's got this tremendous tie-in to the Trump world.
All right, really quickly, Donald Trump's position on abortion, which has been changing over the years and even the past few months. How would you describe it in terms of the Heritage Foundation's proposal?
Well, the Heritage Foundation report is moving even closer to a very stringent restriction on abortion, and the Trump position has been to suggest states should control this. There ought to be controls and rights for women whose life is at risk, or victims of rape and incest. So there's a big difference here between what we're seeing in 2025 project and where Donald Trump has ended up most recently.
Okay, Larry Jacobs, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Good to be with you.
Coming up, what our Republican and Democratic political analysts have to say. Joining us right now, Republican analyst Amy Koch. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
All right, Project 2025, Democrats keep making an issue about it. What are Minnesota Republicans saying?
Right. So this is so interesting because, and I get it, right? This is politics. So any group that is conservative or the Center for American Progress, which is a DFL or Democrat think tank, they come out and they are trying to affect policy, right?
Right.
And definitely they have like right leanings or left leanings. And so it is not unfair to say, well, these are policies that Republicans in general would support. It's where it gets into like kind of faux political is where you try to tie it to an exact candidate and say, this is the plan. This is the plan. They revealed it. This is the nefarious workers behind the scenes. That just doesn't happen. Do they inform? Do they try to push their agendas? Yes. And by the way, politicians can be affiliated with groups. There was the dust up about the Minnesota Freedom Fund, right? Where Vice President Harris encouraged after the George Floyd riots for people to give to that fund. But to tie her, so yes, she was supportive of the fund. Is it fair to tie her to the fund? Somewhat. But also, is she responsible for everything the fund does going forward? Well, no. And the same thing with Project 2025. President Trump has been distancing himself from that. To say that this is his platform is not true. Are there things in there that conservatives like? Sure. Are there things in there that I would support? Yes. Are there some things I don't? For sure. And so I think it is an idea and it is a advocacy group that pushes, conservative ideals. I always say Donald Trump's not really a conservative, so I don't know if this is any of his bag. Time to a conservative group seems unfair.
It's interesting because this is not an official gauge of anything, but it certainly reflects public interest. The emails that we've gotten to the newsroom with wondering what it is, what it's going to do, have been huge. We've gotten a large number of people. People seem to have heard about it and seem to be concerned about it. Usually you get the concerning emails. One of the groups that seems most engaged with this on the Democratic side is the LGBTQ plus community. who are really worried about it. What are you hearing from Republicans? Are they saying these ideas are great and we hope that Trump embraces them, or is anybody talking about it?
No, I'm just not. And so I would caution people. I get it that people have concerns about what other groups think, right? And you can understand why the LGBTQ plus community is concerned about the Heritage Foundation. Of course, they're not going to agree with them. They're not going to like them. But that isn't reflective of every Republican, just as again, Center for American Progress or the Minnesota Freedom Fund is reflective of every Democrat. That's just not how it works. I think it is politically motivating. And so that's how people sort of use it. And by the way, but also it isn't unfair to say, well, this is what some on the right or some on the left, how they really feel. So it is a mix of both. But it's also a political tool that people use to motivate voters. So just be mindful of that and thoughtful.
Do you think Donald Trump follows any kind of blueprint, or is it making it up as it goes?
He really is.
If he is in fact elected president in 2024.
Yeah, I do not think he follows a blueprint at all. I think he has his own thing. So a couple examples. He was not going to announce his VP pick on the Tuesday before the RNC. That was not in the plan. He woke up that morning, decided he was picking JD Vance, and he told everyone, all right, press conference at whatever, we're doing a press conference this afternoon, and I'm picking JD Vance, and we're announcing. So it happens like that, right? And so, yeah, no, I don't believe that he follows a blueprint. The other thing,
including Project 2025.
Including Project 2025. Oh, shoot. And I'm sorry, I know I was trying to think, I had another point along this lines where President Trump, former President Trump, will not be pigeonholed on anything, and he will change his mind like that. We saw him do some things. Remember Kanye and Kim Kardashian came to the White House and were talking about sentencing reform. And he actually made a really big push and passed historic sentencing reform based on largely conversations with, a couple celebrities that felt very strongly about that. And so I just think that he likes to be liked. He likes to do popular things. And when he senses that things are not popular, he'll either try to mold things and push back, sort of, but oftentimes he will acquiesce. And we've seen that where he's distancing himself from the decision on overturning Roe v. Wade. Right now he's saying, well, no, I didn't overturn. I mean, it did overturn it, but it just sends it back to the states, which is true. And the states can do whatever they want. But he's already sort of pulling back from that because he's seen the political reality that is, a good majority of Americans are very concerned and have not been supportive. So.
All right. Well, Amy Cook, thank you so much.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for having me.
Joining us right now, Abu Amara, a Democratic analyst. Abu, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Esme.
All right, Project 2025, people are still talking about it. What is this, and do you think it helps Democrats? Does it hurt Republicans, or is it the other way around? Does it help Republicans, period?
I think as the American people get to learn what Project 2025 is, it's going to radically scare a lot of Americans, and I think it's ultimately going to help the Democrats. I mean, it is the Republican manifesto, the dream world that they would have that would ban abortion across state lines, that would gut the federal government, that would eliminate the Department of Education and regulations around water, clean air. I just think it's a scary prospect that a lot of Americans, the more they get to learn it, the more they're not going to like it.
Okay, Donald Trump says he knows nothing about it and he doesn't know any of the people who are founding it. Obviously, there are a lot of people who are involved in this project that were in his administration, but it's not the Trump campaign's document. It's the Heritage Foundation. I mean, isn't that a legitimate argument for Trump to say, hey, this is not us?
I don't think it's a legitimate argument. As you pointed out, a lot of the members of his administration are the ones who are drafting this policy. And remind you, these are the same people, if Trump wins, who are going to return into the government and implement these policies. And so it's not just a question of, is it just the Heritage Foundation and ideas somewhere else? The people who are drafting these ideas are the ones who are going to come into government if Donald Trump wins.
One of the more unusual aspects of this is it calls for creating a list of potential government hires, like thousands of people, because that's how many you have to hire when a new administration comes in. Does that sort of fit into the last point that you were making?
Absolutely, it does. Personnel is policy. And if you're going to, within the federal government, institute thousands of people who are not subject matter experts, these aren't scientists or doctors, these are political people with a political agenda. And if they are in political positions, they're not going to be doing the bidding on behalf of the American people. They're going to be doing it based on their political worldview. And that's why Project 2025 is so dangerous.
You know, the Department of Education has been a target for Republicans for decades now. Is this part of a larger movement now to let our classrooms stand alone? We decide what our kids can, learn, and we're parents are in the classroom?
Absolutely. Eliminating the Department of Education would remove opportunity for millions of Americans, myself included. Without federal loans from the Department of Education, I wouldn't have been able to afford to go to college or law school or the things that I've been able to do. It is an elimination of opportunity that's at the core of Project 2025 because it's fundamentally concerned with how do we create workers that we can control as opposed to leaders and others in our communities. That's why this is so dangerous. It's not just about today. It's about radically transforming what the future of America looks like.
Well, that's an interesting point. I associated eliminating the Department of Education by sort of eliminating what from the federal government, what is taught in schools. Are they specifically calling for the elimination of a lot of student loans, even though the Department of Education administers those loans?
Yeah, so with Project 2025 deals with the whole gamut of education, all the way from K-12 education through universities. Remember, curriculum, the vast majority of it is set at the local and state level. This idea that the Department of Education is dictating what's happening in classrooms across the country is just not the case. What they would do by neutering education is really leave states to fend for themselves to make sure that, if you're a kid in West Virginia, you might have a different opportunity than a kid in Minnesota. And yes, we have great schools in Minnesota, but we also want to make sure that kids all across America get that same baseline level of opportunity. That's what's dangerous about Project 2025. It makes sure that people fend for themselves, as opposed to saying we're a nation that should have national ideas about how do we inform our kids.
One of the groups that is the most concerned is the LGBTQ community. Project 2025 does call on rolling back certain regulations, a number of regulations involving the LGBTQ plus community. Is that something that's really taken hold? Is that one of the bigger aspects of this in terms of politically, in terms of the attention it's getting?
No question, there are a lot of attacks against many communities with Project 2025. The LGBT community is front and center. It's not just an attack in the kind of marriage space. Project 2025 wants to promote more traditional forms of marriage, which the federal government has no role in whatsoever. But it takes a look at healthcare and really saying what healthcare access can LGBT Americans have in the military, in the roles that LGBT Americans can play in the military. At its core, when it comes to LGBT Americans, it's really trying to create a second-class citizenship for millions of Americans. And again, this is danger. These are dangerous ideas that Americans have been fighting to make better for centuries. And it wants to roll back so much of that progress.
All right, Abu Amar, thank you so much. Always a pleasure.
Thanks for having me, Esme.
Up next, constitutional law professor David Schultz looks at whether a Republican president could enact these policies by himself using executive powers. Joining us right now, Professor David Schultz, constitutional law professor of Hamline University. Thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure, Esme. Thank you for having me.
My question to you is, can some of these goals in the Project 2025 document just be done by the president by himself or herself?
Only a very small percentage could be, very little. Most of it is going to require Congress to pass laws to be able to do what the recommendation of there. And remember, it would take both houses of Congress plus the president to sign a bill into law to be able to do it. But even if Congress did it, there are so many constitutional questions surrounding many of these proposals that it's likely a court or the U.S. Supreme Court might strike down the vast majority, if not all of the proposals that are there.
All right, even this conservative Supreme Court that might go along with some of these philosophical proposals?
Even the current even the current conservative Supreme Court would do that because they are very protective of First Amendment free speech rights. And a lot of the proposals that are here are all about First Amendment and involve First Amendment free speech or freedom of association protections. And they would be pretty likely they would be struck down.
Does that include things like eliminating the Department of Education, eliminating Homeland Security, eliminating Head Start? Those are some of the things that have gotten the biggest headlines. Those are things you're saying could not be done by a president by himself or herself?
Absolutely correct. These were agencies and departments created by law, created by Congress, and it
Okay.
would take Congress to pass a law to get rid of them. At the same time, Congress funds these agencies. And even if, for example, the president were to say, I just don't want to fund them, I don't want to do anything with them, so long as Congress funds them, so long as they are legally in existence, a president can't just refuse to use them, cannot refuse to spend the money that's been appropriated for their purposes.
One of the things they talk about in Project 2025 is the distribution of so-called pornographic material. One of the things that has concerned people, especially in the LGBTQ plus community, is that teachers and librarians distributing books about gay relationships or, I have two dads or transgender issues for teens and young people, that those are the kinds of things that could land a teacher or a librarian in jail. I mean, is that possible?
No, it's not possible. The U.S. Supreme Court over the last 60, nearly 70 years has clearly defined what is obscene versus what's pornographic. Obscene materials are not protected by the First Amendment, but what's considered to be obscene is such a very small category of materials that things such as sex education, materials discussing LGBTQ issues, transgender issues, would clearly be on the side of protected speech. And I cannot see any court striking those down as a form of, let's say, obscene materials. They are clearly protected under, again, what appears to be very settled doctrine for at least 60, 70 years.
How about transforming the civil service employees? There are 50,000 plus federal employees, probably a lot more, that Project 2025 calls for changing them from basically civil service independent, nonpartisan employees into political employees. Is that possible, and what would be the result?
Well, first off, again, it would require law to be able to change their status from civil service to a political appointee. But second, we also have a body of law by the Supreme Court that, again, that goes back nearly 100 years that says that forcing federal employees to engage in partisan political activity would violate their First Amendment free speech rights, considering their political views or basically doing anything that would involve politicizing them raises significant constitutional objections. So what you would have here are, first, you'd need Congress to pass a law. Second, even if they passed the law, the courts would probably strike most of it down under the First Amendment, if not under other provisions of the Constitution, such as due process. But additionally, we should think about beyond the constitutional issues. One of the things that we learned from the 19th century, before we had civil service in place, was the amount of abuse that was going on in the federal government in terms of graft, corruption, inefficiency. Beyond, again, the legal issues, just from the point of view of good public policy and good government, this is not a good idea.
All right, David Schultz, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time.
My pleasure, Esme. Thank you.
And that does it for this edition of Talking Points. As always, please email me with comments and suggestions at esme@cbs.com. Talking Points streams every Wednesday and Thursday at 6:30 and 9:30 p.m. On Friday, the show posts to YouTube for an on-demand viewing. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Esme Murphy, WCCO News.